Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Panel 4, Next Generation College. Please welcome co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, Mr. Doug Letterman, and our distinguished panelists.
You mean you're not distinguished?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Where am I? I'm Doug Letterman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, which is the nation's best source of news and information about higher education. I really appreciate you all being here today. This is sort of the main higher ed panel of the day. The United States asks a very lot of our network of colleges and universities, our very diverse network, and it's the largest network, such network in the world. The institutions are expected to, among other things, prepare and retrain the U.S. workforce, be a springboard to the middle class, fuel local and regional economies, drive research and innovation, and help produce an informed, engaged citizenry. That's in addition to what has long been a fundamental sort of byproduct of helping a whole generations of young people transition to adulthood. And the network's success in fulfilling that set of obligations has long been taken for granted, and American higher education has long been the envy of the world, and to a large extent it remains so. But here at home, increasing questions are being asked by politicians, pundits, and the public about the continued ability of our higher education ecosystem to meet the needs, these various needs. Especially as the number of Americans going to college is radically continuing to increase, and the world that the colleges are preparing students for is changing faster than the institutions do. So I'm joined by a really remarkable group of college leaders, politicians, and others to discuss how well or not American higher education is adapting to this escalating demands on it, and what must change to ensure that it continues to be the driver of individual and national economic success that the country needs it to be. I'm joined by, I'm going to introduce them quickly. Most of them really don't need a lot of introduction, but I'm going to do so really quickly anyway. To my immediate left is Mitch Daniels, who's the president of Purdue University and the former governor of Indiana. To his left is Bill Hansen, who's the CEO of Strata Network, former deputy secretary of education. To his left is Congresswoman Susan Davis of California. To her left is Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, and at the far end is Ted Mitchell, who's the president of the American Council on Education and was an undersecretary of education under President Obama. So I'm going to start by asking them sort of in the moment of the day to grade the American higher education system on a sort of traditional grading scale of C, D, or F. Performance of colleges and universities collectively in meeting the country's needs at this moment. In what of the areas that I laid out or others is this sort of collective ecosystem performing really well and succeeding the most, and in which is it falling short? Maybe start with you, President Daniels.
Well, it's like asking somebody to give the class an average. You're giving an average grade because they're A's and F's, and you know, if I had to guess at an average, I'm going to say C or C minus right now. But that's not to mask the fact that there's some outstanding jobs being done, and I got at least one colleague here who represents one of those. But I think whereas in the aggregate there is a lot of work to do, is in delivering proven value. We've been a blessed sector in this for a long time, in the sense that the customer, the purchaser of our services, was inattentive to price, even associated higher price with greater quality. What a great deal. You raise your price and you don't lose customers, you may even gain some. That's all over. And now, as in every other area in which people apportion their resources, they're looking to make certain that they're getting value out for the dollar in. So that's one. I think we've also got some work to do. I looked back at the Nation at Risk report, which I do once in a while, and and often conclude that we haven't made the progress one might have hoped for those many years ago. Well, there's a very strong reference to the building of a common culture as a responsibility of higher education, promoting producing people who will be qualified to be good citizens in a democratic polity. And there too, I think one could say that in many places we're fostering division and not common purpose. So I, for one, think that we mislead ourselves if we believe, and I sometimes hear at meetings like this, we're just not telling our story well enough. If those people out there just understood the value of what we're doing, it's a communications problem. I've heard that at businesses that were sinking, campaigns that were losing, and government agencies that were failing. So work to do.
Bill?
One of the things, I actually had the opportunity to work for President Reagan at the Department of Education for all 8 years back when I was a very young man, and really one of the terms that I loved was he had his theory of communism. It was the gate theory of communism, of when the gates are opened or people either entering or leaving your country, and the same thing with America. And so I'm going to qualify my grade, but to still say we've got a wonderful system of higher education. When the gates are open, we still have people wanting to come to our campuses, and especially to our terrific campuses that are represented up here on the stage. But I think Mitch, hit it well. I'd probably be C+, if I had to give a grade. And I think again, it's hard to give everybody, put them all in the same boat. But I think, really have some incredible challenges ahead of us. We're a very different system, and maybe we'll get to this later, but our system is built for the 1960s, 1970s. It's built for 18 to 24-year-olds, and when we have 36 million working adults with some higher education but no degree, 50 million working adults with a high school diploma, no higher education, the rugged economy we've had for the last 10 years, the fact is people need a different type of higher education that is not the residential type that we all take for granted, that most of us in the room grew up with or have sent our kids to. And so that's where I think the grade deteriorates, because we have, I think, a huge national challenge on our hands to modernize it, to make it more meaningful to those families and those individuals who need it the most. And right now, it's not available, accessible, affordable, or relevant to them.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman Davis.
I would reflect a lot of those thoughts as well, and it's very great to be here with all of you and to be among all of these experts. I think certainly for the traditional students, we are the envy of the world, and we continue to have students, individuals throughout the world who want to come here and study in America and to be at our research labs and to benefit greatly from that, and certainly to have that heighten their opportunities for themselves and for their families. But unfortunately, I think, as we know, and where we really have to focus our efforts, because the role here, I think, of the federal government and what we need to do is be sure that everybody has an equal chance to succeed. We can't guarantee equal results, as I remember hearing as a school board member in San Diego back in the, 80s. But we also have to have a keen interest and an obligation, I believe, to hold ourselves accountable for being sure that people can succeed in the system. And today, it's very difficult for a student who hasn't had the kind of preparation or the support or the financial opportunities to be able to make some of those choices as they look at many of our higher education schools throughout the country. So that's really our challenge, is how do we do that to be sure that all young people have that? And are there options that could be part of the higher education pathway that we haven't explored as earnestly, as robustly as we can? And that's part of, I think, what we're going to be trying to talk about here. And there are issues that crop up from time to time. I think there's one, interestingly enough, that those in higher ed can address. But, are we, through an early admission system for colleges, perhaps making it harder for young people who need to put together financial packages, who perhaps haven't had others really supporting him or her to know even how to do that, how to negotiate a system. And so we have to think about all of our practices. What can we do a better job to ensure that young people have far more opportunities and that they're certainly not cut out of a system that we know if they had that opportunity to participate in, they would shine?
I think what I would say is 3 grades. So the first grade, 1940 to 1970, that's when the 2 great American innovations came to be. The American Research University came of age during World War II and then began to really take off in that time frame, and the community colleges began to become created in the 50s and the 60s. And if you look back at sort of where we were in that 1940 to 1970 era, I'll pick UCLA, where I have a daughter as a freshman, because she won't go to ASU. The tuition during that time frame to attend the University of California was 0, and the admission requirements were a B average with a B in 15 critical courses. That's an A. That's a university system that's working, and a community college system and private colleges. We didn't have so much a notion of elitist separation. We didn't have this obsession with selectivity. The world was different then. We weren't as socially evolved as we are now. The globe was a lot different. The global economy was a lot different, but I give us an A. 1970 to 2000, the next 30-year time frame, the American economy became a little bit less competitive than it had been in the previous 30 years. The auto industry began to fall back, wasn't innovating at quite the same rate. A whole lot of things that were happening, and I'm not just picking on industrial outcomes. We started charging more tuition. Faculty started teaching less and less and less. The model began to change. Elitism began to drive forward, and I would give us an overall aggregate grade of a B. Since 2000, which has been manifestly a transformative moment in human history because of the internet and computational technology, and then what's going to be happening if I look at the next 30 years, we're 18 years into the period 2000 to 2030, and we're hovering around a C- right now, and we're struggling to keep up with a C-. We've got an unbelievably non-adaptive system to the way that the world is presently operating, to the demand for education. It's going to be lifelong. It's going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be everyone needing to be educated. Colleges are going to need to educate across the entire spectrum of the society, on campus and off campus, over a lifetime. And we're just not prepared to do that. So we're struggling at a C- right now.
I'm going to go with 3 grades as well, but I'm going to do it slightly differently than Michael. I think if you look at that sweep of history and look at where we are today, despite some of the challenges that we might have around issues of access, I think in access we get an A-. As one of the other unique features of our system is that we do a terrific job opening the gate to higher education, to what used to be non-traditional populations and are now the new traditional populations. That's an unambiguous good, but it's challenging. My second grade is for outcomes for people who move through the system. And there, I think, despite some challenges, we're at a pretty high A. The people who come to our institutions, whether they're community colleges or online programs or traditional 4-year schools, finishing still is a key to the ladder of opportunity, openings in the middle class, fulfilling lives, and increased civic engagement, and all of the other measures that that Mitch mentioned earlier. Third grade is how are we doing on actually getting people to complete? Completion grade, D+. We are challenged to make the promises we make to students when they enter our institutions to fulfill those promises. We need to do a better job. It's a big part of the discouragement that we hear, but we simply can't call it a success if we're not succeeding with half or more of our students.
So I'm curious sort of how, that's an interesting alignment that Ted gave. There's been a lot of critique of the outcomes of late, and a lot of emphasis on sort of the sense that American higher education isn't preparing the workforce that we need. And this is coming at a time, as Michael described, of great change in so many things about the nature of the workforce, the nature of the world we live in. Do you think that do you agree with Ted's view that the people coming out of higher education are still pretty well prepared, but we're just not getting enough of them through? Do you think that's which is more or less, I think, Ted, the way you laid it out? Do you agree with that, or do you have a different, do you come at it a different way?
I don't entirely agree. I think that we've lost a lot of rigor in higher education. One reason that the credential, the diploma, is now being challenged and sometimes substituted for is that over time, people, employers, and others in the world beyond higher education found that it wasn't, as they thought, a proof of readiness for work or even citizenship. And so I think in the main it is still the right goal for most young people, but it is not in every case served them well. A lot of people I know, a lot of employers came to view it as a proxy for the brains to get in the first place. But it wasn't clear that the student had learned much while they were at school. And now there are other ways you can get that same measurement, and the student has discovered that you might be able to credential yourself in some quicker and less expensive way.
And Bill, Estrada is very focused
is almost certain, and the other is we're going to weed you out and beat you down. And so those are negative outcome cultures when you're trying to produce a culture of prepared master learners. And so we have a failed academic culture that we've got to attack and address and modernize.
Congresswoman, do you want to add?
Yeah, well, I know we're focused on higher ed here, but a lot of the conference, of course, just exposure to the world of work and help them to begin to think in terms of what is it that I'd like to do? How can I apply what I've learned? I think that we can perhaps have students be in a more readiness position by the time they're going to college and university. And it's true. I mean, today, I think it's interesting. I mean, if you hear a college president say that they're so proud that they get students through school in 6 years, you know, a lot of us would look back and think, well, I wonder why it's taking 6 years. That doesn't mean that the student is not doing as well, but the student may have many other obligations, family obligations, work obligations, keeping another family, eating with a roof over their head. I mean, there are a lot of things that I think students probably didn't face when we think in terms of really traditional students years ago. And so we really have to face that. And I think that we need to listen to our colleges and universities in terms of what is it that they see of incoming students that perhaps we could begin to have that exposure a lot earlier. And we can talk more about some of those ways that we can do that so that a young person's thinking about higher education doesn't necessarily just mean universities and colleges. Everything that we learn is higher education, and particularly when we think about our military and what people are learning in the services and how that is perhaps they're learning and doing at the same time in a way different than maybe a student is doing even at the college level.
Ted, since I asked people to respond to you, I figured you
Well, thanks. And I want to come back, wind up by talking more about the military. I think that in addition, Michael, to it being a cultural issue, and Congresswoman, you talked about this in your opening remark, there just is a set of structural impediments that come from, Bill, what you said about our head and our policies being built around 18 to 22-year-olds, residential, an inoculation model of education where you come in, you get your stuff, you're gone, and you don't have to come back for any treatments. Not only does that not work anymore because of the rapidly changing economy, it doesn't work for the new traditional student, and the dislocations are not randomly distributed in the society. So finding ways for traditional institutions to behave differently, we've got two of the very, very best exemplars of that right here with us. Thinking about new providers who can provide analogs to traditional institutions, and thinking about making better sense of what people are learning in the classroom. I don't think that those are problems. I think that those are enormous opportunities for the sector, and really, really think that between Michael and Mitch and others around the country, we're starting to break the code of how institutions can behave to provide better pathways, multiple exit ramps for the students of today.
So because we have this incredibly diffuse and diverse sort of set of institutions that really don't operate as a system, are we going to be dependent on individual institutions experimenting as Arizona State and Purdue and others do? Is that how, because I guess I'm curious, as leaders of institutions that are out front and driving in certain directions, how do you generate more momentum across a very broad and diverse set of institutions? Michael, maybe you...
Well, so the American tradition, even in higher education, has been to innovate, innovate, innovate. Only people lately have forgotten that. So the colonial colleges were not Oxford and Cambridge or Paris or Bologna. They were small colleges located in towns, funded, chartered by the government. The other schools were not. In other places, the second emergence of the the public colleges, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Virginia, the ones that got off the ground early. Those were examples of the people stepping up, forming up colleges. Then the unbelievable land-grant tradition emerging in the middle of the Civil War. That was a huge American innovation. No one had any, and then the American Research University itself, with Hopkins in 1876 and then Stanford and Chicago being the first two that followed it. Those were tremendous innovations, going back to the publics in the second wave, the community colleges, the state colleges in California, things like that. Those were huge innovations. We stopped innovating. The class of institutions that we need going forward isn't even fully fleshed out yet. We need more types, more variety, more institutions, more alignments. President Spellings and I were talking earlier today about why don't we form leagues among universities that don't have anything to do with athletics? And so we could have the greatest programs in the world built around alliances, another innovation, another way to work together. And so the notion is, will it be driven by innovative forms? Yes. New types? Yes, because that's the way these things happen.
I guess, and that's a question I want to, but so, I guess when you say we've stopped innovating, I mean, you could continue that history you laid out. We had a whole group of institutions, of for-profit institutions that cropped up 25, 30 years ago.
That worked less well.
Well, they've had their flaws, and we've had a set of online-only institutions. So I guess I think you make a good point that higher education historically is not this sort of static.
Right.
But so are we just early in what we hope is going to be an era of
yes, I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
I think things are converging in the right direction.
Okay. Yeah. Others, you want to jump in?
I would even like to congratulate both Mitch and Michael too. They've actually created the University Innovation Alliance, and just by the very nature of this dozen or whatever.
Right. Today's Big Ten, right?
Yeah,
I mean, today's.
there
you go.
It's an incredible group of innovative and disruptive individuals from the largest, most important land-grant universities in the country, and actually hired a young lady several months ago to work for us at Strata, Michelle Weiss, who used to work with Clayton Christensen and with his disruption work. And since she's so much younger, smarter, and hipper than I am, one of my favorite quotes of hers is she loves the ridiculousness. And if you look back 5 years ago of whether I would have had my 16-year-old daughter, jump into a car with a total stranger that she met on an app to take her to an undisclosed location. Well, that's what we're doing today with our new technology, our new approach to transportation. And so, but these are the types of things that are happening with very bold actions that Mitch has taken with the Kaplan partnership and the other activities, and just treating students. And I just one of Michael's favorite comments too. They're very proud of who you accept and not who you reject. But and just one last item too. The polling that we're doing, and I think this comes back to Congresswoman's point. We're learning a lot more too. That the most important things that are going to help students succeed are to be in a institution where they've got a professor or a faculty member that cares about them, have an apprenticeship or an internship program, have a project that's a semester long, that's meaningful and related to their potential career. And all of the data that we're getting back shows that those types of indicators of success are going to create people that are going to be happy with their careers, happy with their pathways in life. And we just got to start applying these things that we're learning into a more meaningful element on our campuses.
Ted, sure.
Doug, I think you got it just right. I think that we're at the beginning, hopefully, of another age, so that our successors 20 years from now can say, and then there was that period from 2016 on, I don't know when the beginning point is, but I think that the behavior that we're seeing, we work with 4-year, 2-year, public, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, and the energy around innovation, whether it's localized innovation, whether it's figuring out what's going on at the University Innovation Alliance and trying to bring that work into other institutions, trying to think through the policy changes that need to happen to make more responsible innovation possible.
Technology.
And then you've got the uses of technology, the growth and development of technology on and off our campuses, and you have the challenge of some new providers, which I know we're going to talk some about, that all of which is creating, I think, a really yeasty environment for reaching students in new ways, reaching new students in new ways, and giving them the skills that they need, not just once, but over a lifetime. I'm very excited about it.
So Bill, you brought up Clay Christensen. He has pretty famously predicted that, it said a few different things at different times, but that significant, maybe even a majority of colleges and universities may cease to exist within 20 years. And we're absolutely seeing a modest uptick. I mean, we don't see institutions close. We're seeing a few more close and merge. I guess I want to broaden the conversation. So if this is actually a surprisingly upbeat conversation about, despite the grades, about whether higher education can adapt here. But there are a whole set of entities out there that are looking at different kinds of credentials and different ways of imparting and building knowledge and creating learners, as to use Michael's term. So how much do you think the overall set of functions that higher education has historically served can be fulfilled by non-traditional institutions, and how much are those other things mostly going to push traditional higher education to change and do better? How do you view that mix? Do you think we're going to see the kind of destruction and disappearance of traditional degrees and credentials and perhaps institutions, or is it going to be something this side of that? Mitch, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, the history of what we now call disruption in various sectors, I don't call us a business, but we are a sector. It says, and Christensen and other scholars in this area will tell you that it is very, very difficult for the incumbent, business or industry, to make change fast enough to fend off either a technological or a business model innovation. What they've done for so long, I mean, when I look at higher education, it is a sitting duck for the same sort of cataclysm that happened to, pick your example, newspapers, record stores, a host of industries which have been, as I say, disintermediated. And by the way, there's no enterprise more easily disintermediated than an information transmission business, and in a way that's what we are. So I think there's a race on. I think there's a lot of inertia and tradition and cultural support for what we do on our side, and so I think it'll buy us time. But I do think there's going to be a shakeout, because I can't find a factor that's working for the long-run expansion of our sector. We're not making any more 18-year-olds, unfortunately, and there are value propositions being offered that are increasingly attractive, I think, to younger people. Now, one thing that's come up here a time or two that I do believe is a part of a brighter future is the opportunity we have not been seizing, or the need we have not been meeting with adult workers, adult learners, those that astonishingly large number of people who started and didn't finish. And that's as far as I'm concerned, that's an obligation that we have, that we have been too many of us have ignored. And it's certainly a huge opportunity if we want to remain very viable and not become, as some wise guy said, the debutante cotillions of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I think that what's really important, and we're all sitting up here and we're talking about students, and it's been a while since I've been one, but I do think, it really is critical to listen to them and to what is it that they're seeking and what would make a difference for them. One of the issues that we also have always is this is it's a kitchen table discussion. Going to college is a big deal. And we are very focused now, as I think we should be, or students who are their first time to go to college. And we applaud that. We're very excited about that. And I think schools go out of their way to be sure that they have a certain percentage of young people who are the first to go to college. What also is important is finding some of these other pathways that are also prestigious. And so that's why I think I don't know that we have to feel as if we're going to lose the college, university going students, but if we can begin in this country to develop another parallel way of going to school. So you're going to school, you're also going back, you're taking an apprenticeship, you're doing a certification program, you're getting excited about that, you love the lab you worked in, you want to go back and do more in the sciences. I think that kind of fluidity, if you want to call it, is something that we need to figure out a way to support. And I would love to know how the federal government can play a better role in doing that so that we can incentivize the right things. I don't think you want to incentivize private businesses, for example, who maybe are in it for the dollar, but not as much interested in how is that changing our economy? How is it making sure that those jobs are going to be available and our students at the same time getting the kind of lesson from the humanities that are also important to them, because what we want in workplaces are people that are multidisciplinary. We don't want people just learning one thing. We want people who can transfer a lot of their learning and they can adapt and they can work in groups and all those good things that we want young people to do. And I don't know whether the programs that they're going to necessarily are doing so much of that. I'm a little more in tune in some ways in San Diego with our public education system. And I see some great examples there. So they are working to develop young people who can do that kind of thing.
President Crow?
Some fool a few years ago asked me, he said, why do you have to have anybody teach calculus? And why do you need new books in calculus? Calculus has been the same for 400 years. I said, really? Calculus is a relatively modern mathematical expression which has been modified and advanced every month for the last many hundreds of years. It's a constantly evolving thing. And so the reason I bring up this notion is that we have to understand that there's not going to be less learning, less knowledge, less need to know. We're going to be trying to understand things that we can barely understand now. Think of Mr. Zuckerberg yesterday. And so the reason for bringing this up is that it's all going in the opposite direction. Learning is going to become this ubiquitous thing. Do we have the right mix of institutions to carry out what's needed? No. Do we have the right configuration? No. Did the for-profit sector make a mistake by calling themselves colleges and universities as opposed to learning centers, learning companies, providing services, doing this, doing that? Probably. They could have done things in a different way, and many of them would still be around, or at least doing better financially if they had. Everybody, biting the dust like Professor Christensen says. I see everybody innovating, clustering, linking, partnering, linking with technology, moving in new directions. And so I see it as a huge opportunity to move in a new direction, for which there's probably likely to be new types of institutions, new alliances between institutions, new notions of learning and so forth. But the most important thing is that this is not static. Everything is accelerating. Even calculus is accelerating. It seems like in this venue and in the city, we should talk a little bit about the federal role. Congressman, you brought it up. What should federal policy, what should the federal government's role in higher education be in this era of a very different set of learners, a very different set of technologies and other ways that can change? And we've got several people who've been in that business, one now and a couple in the past. Maybe Ted, you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. I think that the federal government is at its best in this role when it is, as it does now through Pell Grants and student loans, providing resources to individuals to make choices about where they can best find the learning experience that they need. And so I would start there and say that that's I would hope that would continue to be a non-negotiable as we work our way through policies. Second is, I think on the other side, the federal government needs to, and also is at its best when it's helping to create protections against the behavior of predatory institutions that just aren't doing a good enough job. That's primarily a civil rights function, but it is also a consumer protection function. And after that, I think we haven't talked a lot about research yet today, but one of the pieces of utter brilliance of the system is the research enterprise, and having a robust funding source for the core scientific research, social science research, arts and humanities research that is not just the solution to the next 20-year problem, that's the next 100-year problem. And if we don't do that, I think we've got a long-term problem.
So, but just in general, is that it sounds like what you just said was largely the same functions that have historically been there? Is that I want to sort of...
So I would dial up and I would dial back.
Sure.
So okay. I would dial up the research support and the support for students and families, and I would dial back some of in the name of protection, some of the regulations that are burdensome to institutions and that actually stand in the way of the kind of innovation that we're talking about. A hardy perennial in the University Innovation Alliance is those pieces of federal policy or state policy that they've got to do workarounds to be able to provide.
Bill, you wanted to jump in and then...
I really believe, though, that there's still a lot of incredible modernization that has to happen. The federal government plays a huge role of $180 billion a year into the $500 billion infrastructure in higher education on an annual basis. And so there are sticks, there's carrots, there's... but I would say one of the biggest challenges we have, and I go back to even when President Reagan was in office, there just is an important role for the federal government to be the equalizer. And I think to Ted's point on, it was created, and most of its programs were even created before the department was, whether it's special education or the civil rights protections or the Pell Grant program or others, to help create the equal access and opportunity for our disadvantaged students. But at the same time, one of the things that the federal government, after 15 years of still recovering, for the last 15 years being gone, is one-size-fit-all rules and regulations don't work. And the federal government can sometimes help spur innovation and reform, and other times it can suffocate it. And that's where I think you've got to be very balanced. I think our accreditation system is broken, and I think it needs to be modernized with our where all the new trends and challenges of the future are. Our world is changing. It's getting smaller through technology and globalization. We've actually got to be more flexible, more pliable, more able to meet the future needs and the really accelerating future needs. And the one-size-fit-all type of natural instinct that Washington always brings to solutions to bear is something I think we've got to be very wary of and very cautious of.
Yeah, please, Michael.
So a number that's, I think, really important that we lose track of in all of the things that we seem to argue about in politics these days is we need 4% economic growth, not little meaningless discussions about 2%, 2.3%. Maybe we're going to have 1.6%. We need 4% economic growth, not so that we can all become fat, rich, and happy, but so that we can continue to accelerate social mobility in the United States. So social mobility requires economic wealth generation. It requires the distribution of that economic wealth generation across the population. You can do that through taxation and redistribution, which is not advisable, or you can do that by providing for social mobility to people through educational attainment. And so the thing that we need from the federal government is to make certain that we stay focused on social mobility as a core objective, that we make sure that no one is left behind. So we've got 160 million people in the lower half of our family incomes, and we have a 15% college attainment rate. As Bill said earlier, we have a 1.5% improvement in the college attainment rate for people in the lower quarter of our family incomes in the United States. That's the population of Germany. in the United States. Our economy is not going to grow 4% if we're leaving half the population behind. And I'm not talking only about college. And so what we need is a focus on 4% economic growth. The Department of Education should be focused on economic success of the United States through educational attainment. The Department of Education should be focused on enhancing social mobility by every possible means, but not through redistribution. And we should be focusing on access by ensuring it through Pell Grants and other mechanisms that people are then held accountable for the outcomes. We shouldn't be giving Pell Grants to people to go to college that people don't graduate from. And so they shouldn't get those. They shouldn't get college loans to go to places that don't produce graduates. We need accountability in all of this. And then lastly, we have I don't know what it is, $1 trillion industry in education if you count every tuition dollar and so forth and so on. And it's got a really poor research track record. It does not have research devoted to enhancing learning outcomes. We should have devices, tools, mechanisms that are unbelievably powerfully driven towards the individual learner. Don't know why we don't have those. We should have those, and then we'd have more economic growth as a function of that. So that's what I think the federal government should focus on.
Anybody else? Congresswoman?
I loved
Just
hearing
taking
all
advice?
of that, frankly, because if I were to give our effort a grade in trying to live up to what that role should be, I think we're probably around a C-. And that is disappointing because I don't think the kind of robust discussions are occurring at that level in really defining what is it and who are we? You know, how can we play that role better? We certainly have a protective role, and I think that, and in the financial, it's kind of leveling the playing field for young people. But in reality, it doesn't quite happen that way. And we really are not securing the resources for education, for the community colleges at the state level. Our higher ed universities, I think, are finding their way because they do have a lot of support in the community. But our community colleges, as we know, that are doing a tremendous job today in making sure that people are aligning with the skills that are needed in their community, still doesn't get the resources that it really needs to perform in a way that they, I think, can. So all of those issues should be discussed more, and so I welcome the push.
President Daniels, anything from your seat in Indiana?
Well, correlation is not causation, but if you buy Michael's declining grade report that he gave the system, you would observe that the more the federal government has done, the more the federal government has spent, the worse the grade has become. And, you know, that's, there are certain respects in which that's hard to argue with. One reason college costs too darn much today, this is all very well established now, is that with the best of intentions, we've flooded the marketplace with loans and grants and so forth, and 70 cents or something of that went into higher ed's pocket. It has made it all too easy for costs to rise to the level that causing a lot of the problems we have now. The only other thing I'll say that might be additive is, I mean, what the biggest threat to this country long term is the biggest near term threat to higher education funding, which is an entitlement, so-called system, which is devouring the federal budget. And it's putting an inexorable squeeze on spending for very necessary government programs, everything you call discretionary, and starting with education. And we can talk all we want about more resources, but until somebody agrees, until a lot of people agree to attack that problem, you're not going to be able to increase them. In fact, you're going to see them inevitably squeezed and shrunken.
Well, the author of the hypothesis you referred to is coming up next. I think we had. Do we have a question from the audience? I was told we did. Over. Yeah, please.
We do. I'm over here. Good afternoon, and I want to thank all the panelists. I represent a small private liberal arts college that happens to be the alma mater of Ronald Reagan. I'm Dr. Jamel Wright, where I have the honor of serving as president of that college. And so I appreciate oftentimes, and all of you all will understand this given your respective roles, we focus a lot on the what and the why, but not enough on the how. So we've diagnosed the problem, we figure out why it exists, and not enough on the how. So I also commend you all on starting to really address some of the hows and the how-to. So I want to challenge that a little bit and use President Crow, a couple of things that you talked about in terms of connecting and, you know, different size institutions working together. And I want to just challenge all of you all to answer that question of how exactly do we move forward with that process. And I'm going to use not 12 years, but 15 years, which would put us 50 years out from this report, A Nation at Risk. In 15 years, over the next 15 years, how exactly do we address some of these major issues, as complex as they are, including the broken system as it pertains to student loans and Pell Grants, including the increasing divide when you look at students who are in need, who are unable to, who are first-generation college students. We have about 2/3 of our students are first generation who are unable to understand and navigate the system as complex as it is. So how do we do some of these things, and how do we, as respective different types of institutions, leverage our strengths to really see the type of success that we need over the next, I'm going to say 15 years. So I'll add another 3, President Crow, if you don't mind, which I think we're going to need all the time we can get. So.
Yeah, and we have about 3 minutes to answer all that. So go ahead, President Crow.
Well,
first shot.
I'll give you a short. I'll try to give you a short answer. So I got sick of listening to people, and we got sick of listening to people that saying that every kid couldn't graduate from high school. What do you mean every kid can't graduate from high school? So then they said, well, you guys graduate kids from college, so why don't you shut up? So I said, okay, well, we'll start some charter schools. So we did, 3 of them. We have thousands of students. We have 100% high school graduation rate. The point is not, and these are normal public, you know, stand in the door, get in the line, come to the school. Every family income, every background. So the first year that we could produce high school graduates, we had a 98% college or high school graduation rate. Well, I said, that's really good, but that's a failure. The team has failed. We don't have 100% high school graduation. So the point is not so much the details of the high school graduation rate at the charter schools that ASU is running in Central Phoenix or in other parts of Arizona, and we're expanding this. It's that the notion is that you set expectations. It doesn't make any difference what size anything is. It doesn't make any difference what size the college is, what size the elementary school is, what size the high school is. It makes no difference. It's that we're not setting the goals at the right level. 100% high school graduation rate, 100% something after high school. You keep learning after high school, regardless. Military, vocational school, chef school, whatever, college, associate's degree. You're going to keep going. If we start setting the goals and take no excuses to attain the goals, then we're going to see the kinds of changes in a relatively short time frame.
Anybody else want to have jump in, or do you want to let that be the last word? Mitch?
Prioritize costs. We announced this morning that we will extend to year 7 a no tuition increase, and our school will be less expensive to attend in 2020 in nominal dollars than it was in 2012.
We followed you with no tuition increase too.
Yep. You know, why 4 years? Why not faster? Our liberal arts college now offers all its degrees on a 3-year track. Use a little summer, heavy up a little, same number of credits, but move through faster, therefore less expensively, start life a year sooner. Reach out to students in new and different ways. As of 10 days ago, we're twice as big as we were because we acquired an online university and will now serve, starting with 30,000, I hope one day many more, a multiple of that. Average student, 33 years old, woman, probably more likely minority than not, working with a family. That ocean of people who can really improve their lives if we can find a way to reach them, and many of our institutions have not been attentive to that before. So there's huge opportunities. We can make that kind of transformation before we are devoured, you know, by the disruptors. But there's no time to lose, and simply tweaking the model we've had probably will, unless you're sitting on a bulletproof endowment, is probably not enough.
We're going to have to let that be the last word. I want to thank Mitch Daniels, Bill Hanson, Susan Davis, Michael Crow, and Ted Mitchell. Thanks to all of you.
Please welcome 19th United States Secretary of Labor, the Honorable Ann Korologos.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Looks like standing room only, so please take your seats. I want to say how honored I am to be part of this really very historic event, the first Reagan Institute Summit on Education. First is an operative word. It means there'll be a second, third, etc. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speakers, but in doing so, I'm reminded of a meeting I had with President Reagan when I was Secretary of Labor. We were discussing a fairly controversial issue, and I remember saying, "I'm sure going to get bruised over this." And he responded, "Ann, you only get bruised when you try to accomplish something." That said, our next presentation will be a conversation between two secretaries of education who have received their share of bruises. One past, the other present. In doing so, they both understand all too well that education should prepare students to inherit the blessings and liberties of a free society. They both know that education is the key to unlocking the doors of opportunity for one of our most precious commodities, every child. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from these two fine leaders about several things. Where we began after the 40th President's speech in 1983, when he characterized our system of education as putting our nation at risk, and where we are today, 35 years later. What's the same? What's better? What's worse? And moreover, what's the plan to move forward? Having served in the President's cabinet, I witnessed and experienced the challenges of such responsibilities at this level. Therefore, I am honored to introduce our first panelist, my former colleague and President Reagan's Secretary of Education from 1985 to 1988, Dr. William J. Bennett, currently chairman of Conservative Leaders for Education. Describing education as the architecture of the soul, he became known for his quick wit, his remarkable energy, his extraordinary tenacity, and an exceptionally inquisitive mind. President Reagan said, and I quote, "Bill Bennett has spent a lifetime taking serious ideas seriously." Seriously. As an aside, let me mention on a personal note that Bill Bennett as Secretary of Education, and then Bill Verity, Secretary of Commerce, and I as Secretary of Labor, met one day to plan what became a day-long discussion and a report, Building a Quality Workforce. It was held July 1988. In the pre-planning meeting, I looked at Bill Bennett. I said, "Okay, bud, if you educate everyone the way you should," I looked at Bill Verity and I said, "and you create jobs for them, I'm sitting pretty as Secretary of Labor." So that was our effort. So today, let us all agree and come to realize that the challenge must be met now, today. Facing that challenge has fallen on our current Secretary of Education, Ms. Betsy DeVos. Known as an advocate for school choice, Secretary DeVos is facing a number of pressing issues: school safety, the appropriate role of the federal government in education, state implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, overcrowded, underfunded schools, teacher training and readiness, parental involvement, what constitutes a quality education, just to name a few. She leads the Department of Education during a time of accelerating change, both in the education sector and in the world at large. And so let's hear what these distinguished guests have to say, for after all, they understand all too well that education is our future. Once you've got it, it's never lost. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Secretary Betsy DeVos and Secretary William J. Bennett. Thank you and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know about you. This used to happen to me at universities. I'd be introduced by the president, and then he'd leave. I don't know why, but anyway. If you see me limping, I'm limping. It's not because of old age. It's because of torn cartilage. Quick story. We had 3 black labs in a row. When we went to buy our 4th, people who sell us the dogs said, get a golden one, a yellow one. You'll see him better at night, and you won't trip over him. I tripped over him at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So some things, anyway, I'm limping a little bit, but still able to take a bruise and occasionally give a bruise. Betsy, how do you like the job?
I like the job a lot.
You do?
On most days.
Yeah.
I do. No, it's a privilege to serve, and anytime I have a moment of question, all I have to do is picture one of the students that I've had the opportunity to interact with that may be helped ultimately, and that sets it all straight.
Do you find, as I did, that actually what you just said, visiting the schools, talking to the students, no substitute for that?
No substitute for that.
Reading the reports is interesting, but seeing the kids and seeing the work is...
Right.
Yeah.
Seeing the possibility.
What are the hardest parts?
I think the hardest challenge is trying to help people understand how much we need to change. And we know that the forces of the status quo don't want to do that. And yet, we're going to talk about some of the NAEP results this week. We know that the way we've done things simply isn't working for too many students, for too many kids, and we need to see things done differently. We need a lot more creativity.
Okay, let's talk about what those things might be in a minute, but let's first describe the NAEP scores, the nation's report card. What do we see?
Well, I'd like to first, also reference what we are convened around today, and that is the recognizing the 35th anniversary of a Nation at Risk report, and say we are still a nation at risk, and I would say at even greater risk today when we think of the many different technological changes and advancements in every other area of society. And today it is, I believe, both a national security risk and interest, and it's certainly our economic future that is at stake. And if you look at the past, since NAEP was started here, the screen up on the board shows you there's really been overall about a 2% change in 4th grade reading results in all of the years since NAEP was begun. And it just points to stagnation. Yeah. And if you look at then the commensurate spending, per pupil spending, it's gone up since the Nation at Risk was put forward 75% in 2016 dollars, 75%. And if you look at those together, you see quite a divergence. Scores continuing to muddle along, unremarkable as was stated many different places this week, and yet look at the spending. This is not something we're going to spend our way out of, and it's not something we're going to mandate or regulate our way out of.
There is some good news, though, right? If we disaggregate the data, if we break it down, there are some places that this last NAEP 2017 suggested knew what they were doing, or even more, knew a great deal about what they were doing and were improving.
Yeah, I would really want to highlight Florida, which began very comprehensive reform efforts in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in 1998, they ranked 47th to 49th in all the NAEP scores. And they, under the leadership of former Governor Bush, really were intentional about looking at student-centered reforms that would make a difference. So you look at the fact that they introduced transparency for parents to know how the schools are doing, an A through F grading system. They introduced a lot more flexibility at the local level, giving and empowering school leadership to try things and do things differently. They went after and really improved teacher certification efforts and gave different pathways to become certified as teachers. They implemented a third grade reading requirement, knowing that if students aren't reading by the time they exit third grade, it's a really rough road ahead, learning to read versus reading to learn. And they introduced the most rigorous or the most generous and broad merit pay system for teachers. And then they also introduced a number of choices, including a tax credit scholarship program, a couple of programs targeted at special needs students, and these reforms have borne out. They now are 5th and 8th in fourth grade NAEP scores, and it's really attributable, I think, to this concerted effort to tackle reforms on a student-focused, student-centered basis and do what's right for kids. So today in Florida, 46% of students choose schools other than their assigned school, and that doesn't even account for the percentage of families that move to a place and pay whatever the real estate market requires to live there. So the vast majority of students in Florida are in schools and in education environments of their parents' choosing. And I think this is a model for other states to look at and emulate. And I hope that other states are going to look at all of the ways Florida has gone after this and continued to go after this.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that continued because as we learned over and over again from education of children, young children, it's fine to do good preschool stuff, but you need consistency because those things can wash away. They can just disappear. But over time, the reinforcement of the same things can make a difference. And Jeb Bush, not so long ago, but some time ago, and yet Florida's been consistent in its emphasis, I think, from Governor Bush, Governor Scott, and they have stayed with it. The second thing, and please comment on that if you want, but the second thing I wanted to mention is if we draw down a little deeper, dive down a little deeper, individual cities and communities in Florida, about which the NAEP told us as well, have done particularly well, correct?
Yes, there were 3 TUDAs that participated in that voluntary study, and all of those urban areas showed improvements. I think importantly, too, the results for Florida's NAEPs demonstrated that not only students at the top end of the performance scale, but those at the bottom end of the performance scale improved. And we saw some improvements for those at the top end in other states, but Florida is really the only place where you saw improvement with those that really need the most help. And again, I would argue it's because they really have been very intentional about these student-centered reforms, and they've stuck with them, and they've continued to improve on them and iterate, and have acknowledged that this is not a destination, that they have to continue to make changes and try new things and do things differently for students to be able to succeed.
And Miami's one of those places, right? So that if the kids are doing well in Miami, then arguably, like the lyric goes to New York, you can make it anywhere. If the kids in Miami can be brought up to that level of achievement, one would think you could do it elsewhere as well. What do we do then? I remember one of the first publications, you're so right about the continuum here. I was saying a lot of these things in the 80s, said them in the 90s, the same things remain true. One of the publications we put out back then was called What Works. So it would seem from what you're saying, Florida has some idea of what works, and it's doing it, hasn't forgotten it, it's continued to do the same thing. How do we get other states to do what works? Because if you look at those scores again, you look across the board, a lot of states flat, some down. Why won't, if you have a development in medicine, other doctors will do the same thing. They'll do it in other states. Is there a jealousy? Is there a pride of place? Why not say, let's go to Florida and figure out what they're doing?
Well, I hope that other governors and legislators will do that and will take notice of these results. But we know that the forces of the status quo are very strong, and change is hard. But what we are doing simply is not right for too many students, and it's not acceptable, and we shouldn't stand for it. We just came in 4th in the Winter Olympics, and I heard people outraged about this. Well, I don't hear the same kind of outrage about the fact that we're 40th in the world in math. Why is that? we should be outraged. We should continue to say this is not acceptable. We need change, but it needs to happen primarily at the state and the local level, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and there shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, but there are things to be learned, and I mean there is a state of the art. There are things that we know, and there are things that we know that work. I remember with the success of, you remember the great Jaime Escalante, the Stand and Deliver, the math teacher, calculus teacher in California. And I remember when I went out and visited him, I saw his principal first. And I said, this must be the most popular guy in the school. And they said, no, he's not. He's very popular with parents and kids, but not with some of the other teachers. And I said, why not? Well, because he gets these great achievement levels with his kids and they don't. He teaches calculus and they don't know how. Well, there's something wrong there, right? There's something definitely wrong.
Indeed.
I wanted to say something about just a bit of a plug because of the state-to-state comparison and learning state-to-state. This organization I'm with, Conservative Leaders for Education, we talk with a group of people. Frankly, I didn't spend nearly as much time as I should have when I was secretary. These state legislators who have a vision, who have ideas of things to do, and we get them together, and they're from many different states. We have about 20 members now to compare notes on what's successful. So to try to regularize this notion of finding out what works and seeing if it's replicable in another place.
And I salute you for doing that and encourage you to keep it up, because you're right, state legislative leadership can make a huge difference. And I urge and encourage them to not only take, I think a lot of them feel like, okay, if we do the third grade reading component, we can check the box and we're going to get change. It's got to be a whole lot more than that. It really does have to be a comprehensive approach to making the framework such that the results are going to be different from every local community and from every school building, but allowing the kind of creativity and innovation that needs to happen at that local level. Putting that framework together at the state level is really critical to that. And there are some states that are down the road toward that, but they haven't been, I don't think, any of them as comprehensive as Florida has been.
Yeah, I did notice, because I've spent some time there and spent some time with the governor, Arizona, Doug Ducey. They were flat this year, but I think they had made
the previous years they've
previous 2 or 3
improvement.
And particularly, I know, area of special interest for you is in the whole charter area. Their charter schools are just scoring off the shooting the lights out. They're just doing very, very well. I know some people have criticized. It's interesting, have criticized Arizona for being the Wild West here in education, but they're trying different things, and I think most important, they're trying to measure what happens as a result of trying different things.
Right, absolutely. And you know, I have visited a number of traditional public schools that are taking different approaches. One of them in Casper, Wyoming, a very, unsuspecting place, where for 25 years, the elementary school I visited has been totally teacher directed. And just within the last 2 or 3 years, they've switched to a competency mastery-based approach. So they have multi-age classrooms, and the lines are very blurred between grades. And within that district in Casper, parents have the choice of sending their child to any of the elementary schools. And so the parents and the students I met there are very thrilled with that approach, and the students are very happy. They're thriving at that school. So they've done something different outside of the norm. Another school I visited in Indiana, the school in the Indianapolis district, and the teachers and the leadership there have totally reorganized and done things the way they wanted to set them up, and the students as a result are doing. They've gone from an F to an A school in a matter of a year and a half or 2 years. And they were telling me that they realized they needed a Saturday program for some of the students. And within a month, they had it up and running. Well, if they were still asking permission of the next level of command, they would have been still waiting. So these things can be done. It just takes the will to do them.
And your visits are no small thing either, I know. And believe me, it'll last. People come up to me and say, you visited my school when I was in the 4th grade, I remember. Because you had those bodyguards with you. Anyway, that's what the little kids remember. But that can be a very big thing. I remember Ronald Reagan, considering the auspices here, which we are present, they called the White House called up and said, Ronald, the president wants to visit a school. So we went over here and visited Suitland High School. And the president got up and talked for a while, and then a bell rang, and the president, you know, very mindful of his truancy when he was a boy, said, I guess I better stop because they're going to change classes. I could go on. And I said to the principal, the president could go on. And the president said, well, I don't want to interfere with math or civics or something. I said, Mr. President, this is a pretty good civics class right here.
Very good civics class.
So he went on for another
awesome.
For another out. It really was awesome. Let's shift gears because you talked about headlines, the Olympics, education. Some things that do make the headlines are in another part of your work, and that's in higher ed. We hear about Title IX, we hear about student loan business, we hear about things that are very deep, very significant, very important, very expensive. Higher ed, I found, I didn't know it when I started, that in some ways I had more leverage on some of the higher education issues than in the elementary and secondary.
Well, and you know, the whole question of what is higher ed, I think is a really relevant one today. And
what's it for? Yeah.
Yeah. What is it for? And you know, I've said before that I think for too long we have given the subtle or sent the subtle or not so subtle message that the only way to succeed as an adult is to go to a four-year college or university. And yet today we have over 6 million jobs that require some level of education beyond high school that are going unfilled. We don't have a good way currently to help direct students, to expose them to these opportunities. And as Congress considers reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, one which was of course passed in 1965, just a few things have changed since then, I think it would behoove them to take a couple steps back and say, what is the role of the federal government in supporting education beyond high school? And we need to take down the silos that have artificially grown up between career and technical education and traditional four-year, because they're really getting blurred in the marketplace today, and yet we insist on keeping them pretty siloed in this town. I've visited a number of really innovative high schools that are exposing students as early as junior high to a multitude of pathways. Just last week I was in the Dallas area at Birdville. It's a career and technical high school that has, I think it was about 25 different pathways that students could pursue. Now, many of these students will ultimately go on to a four-year college or university, but many of them will come out of this high school with certifications ready to go into a good, high-paying job immediately. Well, those kinds of things need to be more prolific and proliferated and available to more and more students. McMinnville High School in Oregon I visited as well, another really intentional program that is introducing kids to a wide variety of opportunities to pursue both dual credit, dual enrollment, so they come out with, some of them with associate's degrees, or come out prepared to go into the next step. But I think we need to be looking at learning as really a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah, so a philosopher, education said it's not enough for a man to be good, he's got to be good for something. And I wonder if we have been guilty, maybe myself, with a PhD in philosophy, of thinking of education as the liberal arts, the humanities and social sciences, and looking down our nose at people who know how to do things, who work with their hands. And you can't export that. You can't send that overseas. And that's where a lot of these jobs are, correct? And we can do both, right? I mean, we can have literacy, we can have numeracy, and we can teach people different things. But I think there has been a built-in bias against the practical, if you will. Mm-hmm.
No, that has been the case, but I think that we have to acknowledge there are fewer and fewer traditional higher ed students today, and that over the course of the lifetime of someone who's in kindergarten today, they can look forward to a dozen or more different careers in their lifetime.
Right. When you talk to in your life, you have done so many things. One of the things you've interacted with the corporate community, and now you're interacting with the corporate community in a different way. When you meet with CEOs, I'm thinking of what Ann said about the intersection of labor and education. What is it that people in the corporate world tell you they want from American schools that they're not getting?
Well, I think there are some core competencies that it would behoove all students to learn, and it would behoove all education institutions to focus on. And I'm not sure that that's been part of the narrative until lately. And being able to communicate well, being able to collaborate and work well with others, to think critically, and to be to foster creativity. And I think back to my own experience in school, and also observe students today who, kids are creative when they're little toddlers and very young. And I fear that all too often we try to sort of fit them in boxes and make them conform to something that they're not. And by the time that they're in, late elementary school or middle school, a lot of that creativity has been really, really, tamped down in a big way.
Right. I've talked to employers who've told me, somebody heard me give remarks, he said, you make it sound as if you want the schools to teach what it is we do at this company. He said, I don't want you to do that. He said, just give me a workforce of people with a good attitude, show up on time,
yes.
Basically literate, communicate, can get along with other people. And lately I've been hearing, don't have an attitude problem about work. We all like TGIF. Is it Friday? No, tomorrow. Anyway, so soon enough. But we'll teach them. We'll teach them the rest. We'll teach them how to make the widgets here. But those sort of basic, you talked about basic competencies, but certain attributes of character and person as well to be be able to pass a drug test, for Pete's sakes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
John Boehner. Yeah, excuse me. Go ahead. Sorry.
And I really encourage those in the business community to engage educators and education because, again, I think the silos have been artificially constructed there.
Right.
And I think it's imperative that the business community have a voice into what's happening in K-12 education and certainly in higher ed. And again, I can refer to a school that I visited in Tennessee, in Murfreesboro, where the Chamber of Commerce and some of the large employers in the area came together with this high school and again created a program, or a bunch of programs and pathways for students to get a taste of what could be with some of the large employers in the area and what those futures might look like, and would get them prepared for engineering and other four-year pursuits. But it was really a very cohesive effort, and I was very admiring of the way the business community was brought in and welcomed to be a part of that conversation. And it has to be a two-way street because I think there's been a resistance to really engage business in some of these efforts.
Yeah, and what I've found is there's a certain reluctance. Some of these hard-driving business types, when they're hard-driving their own business, will not tell you what they're really thinking when it comes to education. Say, well, we want to hear from you in the same candid way that you would run your company. And that would be, I think, a very good exchange.
Right.
What's interesting in listening to you, I see we're running out of time, but I was going to encourage you at the end to visit more schools, but you've already cited about 7, which is great. To make each point, you talked about a visit. So Shakespeare says to give to every abstraction a local habitation and a name. And you've given a lot of local habitations and names. And thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, Secretary.
I think we both hope when we meet in 20 years, 25 years with the Secretary of Education then, that we'll say, it's not flat anymore. It really, after DeVos, it just really went up and just kept going.
I'm very hopeful that for our nation's future that we have to go in that direction.
Not at risk anymore. How about that? How about a book in 20 years, not at risk anymore?
That would be a wonderful thing.
And we'll blurb it. You and I will blurb it. Okay?
There we go.
Thank you, Secretary DeVos. Thank you very much. What do we do now?
I think we exit.
We exit?
I think we exit.
Left or right?
This way.
Okay.
Are you okay with your knee?
Yeah. Okay, good.
Our schools hold the future of America in their hands. They will decide whether that future is enlightened, free, and informed, or shrouded in the darkness of ignorance.
The future of America depends on you. And no matter what you want to do with your life, I guarantee that you'll need an education to do it. What you make of your education will decide nothing less than the future of this country.
The educated citizen knows how much more there is to know. He knows that knowledge is power, more so today than ever before.
That child deserves a world where everyone can get a quality education.
Take a kid in the 50th percentile in the 4th grade in math. Give that kid an excellent teacher for 2 years. That child will be in the 80th percentile.
Education is to get you to poke holes in theories, to question, to be loath to accept anything at face value.
America's a melting pot, and education has been a mainspring for our democracy and freedom, a means of providing gifts of knowledge and opportunity to all citizens, no matter how humble their background, so they can climb higher, help build the American dream, and leave a better life for those who follow.
We need to invest in very different ways. Get the students the support they need, get them the best principals, get them the great teachers. I promise you, those students will do extraordinarily well.
But I urge you, in spite of your economic plight, stay in school. And when you discover what you're going to be in life, set out to do it as if God Almighty called you at this particular moment in history to do it.
Education is transformative. It literally changes lives. That is why people over the centuries have worked so hard to become educated. More than any other force, education can help to erase arbitrary divisions of race and class and culture and unlock every person's God-given potential.
What are you going to do with what you have? I'm not talking about how much you have. Some of you are business majors, some of you are theologians, nurses, sociologists. Some of you have money, some of you have patience, some of you have kindness, some of you have love, some of you have the gift of long suffering, whatever it is, whatever your gift is. What are you going to do with what you have? We need you. We need your youth, we need your strength, we need your idealism to help us make right that which is wrong.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the closing plenary. The Purpose of Education. Please welcome Dr. Jill Biden.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Yes, I stand between you and the cocktails, I guess. So you'll have to forgive me, but I've just come from my day job as an English professor, and I'm kind of still in teacher mode. And so I'd like to start with a question. So, why are you here today? Of course you're here because this summit is important. Because here because you're passionate about finding bipartisan solutions. But there's another reason as well. Everyone who is here today, everyone who cares this much about education has a reason. A teacher pushed you to dream you could make a difference. A child who inspired you to make the world a little bit better for her. A time when you realized no one else was going to do the hard work of changing things if you didn't answer the call. Well, we all have a reason why we're here today. Mine is my grandmother. She taught at an old-fashioned one-room schoolhouse, crammed with 3 grades of students. Some days, she would take me with her to her school. And when I was lucky, I got to ring that brass bell that called her students to class. She was a good teacher. She loved it. And her students could tell. She didn't just teach letters and arithmetic. She opened up worlds for the kids that she taught. When she read to us from Charlotte's Web, Harold and the Purple Crayon, and my favorite, Mary Poppins, she was spellbinding. And every child who passed through the walls of her little classroom became enchanted, including me. I wanted to do that. I wanted to help kids see the world in a different way. I wanted to show them how books about strangers in far-off places could teach them about themselves. I wanted to help them find their own voices through writing. I thought if I could do what she did, if I could set just one student on a better path, that would be really special. I've been a teacher for more than 30 years now. Shortly after we moved to DC, I started teaching at Northern Virginia Community College. And as I said, I continue that job till today. Through the Biden Foundation, I'm continuing the work that we started as Second Lady, advocating for community colleges. And as chair of the College Promise, I'm working to help cities and states across the country create pathways to free college for hardworking students. Every day I get to do this work. I'm so grateful that I chose to follow in my grandmother's footsteps, because every day I see just how powerful education can be. I teach veterans seeking to translate their hard-earned skills into a civilian workforce. I teach single moms hoping to make a better life for themselves and their families. I teach refugees looking to find community in a place they thought might never feel like home. When I first started teaching, about 1 million years ago, I was a reading specialist and helped high school students overcome years of frustration and finally learn to read. Through teaching, I've been able to give my students the gift of confidence, of connection, and hopefully inner strength. And in return, they've given those gifts right back, sometimes in surprising ways. A few years ago, I had to tell my class that I would miss the next session for personal reasons. My students have a lot of shining qualities, but boundaries are not one of them. So they immediately began shouting, Dr. B, where are you going? Well, my sister was having a stem cell transplant, the first of her cancer treatments, and she would be isolated in a hospital room for 6 weeks. I tried to explain with as much composure as I could muster, but, the words caught in my throat. I turned and I faced the whiteboard, hoping to hold back my emotions. And when I turned back around, the entire class was standing. They lined up and they gave me a hug, one by one. That is the power of teaching. Education connects us to our world. It creates opportunities. It helps us grow into the people we want to become. And when we give our students the gift of knowledge, they use it to lift up their families and towns and communities. We all rise. And that's why we're here today. From different administrations, from both sides of the aisle, from across our nation, we're here because we believe that quality education is a key to strengthening the middle class. Because we believe it's the foundation of a strong democracy. And because we believe, in fact, we know that the future of our economy depends on it. When you turn on the news these days, it seems like there's no common ground left in this country. Pundits and talking heads would have us believe that the divide between left and right or rich and poor is just too big to cross. But when I talk to my students, when I travel, when I visit schools and organizations all over this country, that's not what I see. Everywhere I go, from remote rural towns to the busiest cities, people tell me they want the same things. They want a safe place to send their kids. They want them to learn and grow. They want them to have better opportunities than they did. Education isn't about red or blue. It's about our kids. It's about our economy. It's about our future. Because a stronger workforce, we all want that. Better wages for middle-class families, we all want that. Lower unemployment, we all want that. This is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's an American issue. And America deserves the best educational opportunities in the world. When my grandmother died, she didn't leave behind a big estate, but what I inherited from her, and I still have to this day, is that brass bell that she used to let me ring. And when I think about that bell, I think about the way her legacy, that love of learning, of education, has rung out into the world like waves of sound. I think of every student she touched and wonder what amazing things they grew up to do. I think of the children who learned kindness and courage at her feet, and the adults they became. Perhaps they're public servants working to make our communities a little stronger, a little more fair. Perhaps they are community and national leaders like all of you. And of course, there's at least one teacher. One of my favorite poets from the 13th century Sufi master is the Sufi master Rumi. And there's a verse of his that I think about a lot. It goes, "Let the beauty of what you love be what you do." We have all taken different paths to get here. But we've gathered to do the same thing. Come together to lift up our students, strengthen our schools, make a world that is worthy of our children, rise together. So I want to end by saying thank you again to the Reagan Institute for creating space for this important conversation, and to all the teachers, educators, and leaders who are here today. Thank you for your passion, for your commitment to our schools, for letting the beauty of what you love be what you do every day. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our expert panel. With us are 4 former U.S. Secretaries of Education who've served our nation. No one understands the challenges and opportunities we face better than this group. Please welcome Secretaries Rod Page, Margaret Spelling, Arne Duncan, and John King. And yeah, give them a... Moderating our session tonight is a White House veteran of a different sort, a pioneer in the world of political reporting, Ann Compton. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the final act. And when you've heard a lot about risk and challenge over this day of conversation, I have the 4 that I am going to introduce in chronological order to get started, to talk about, Madam Secretary, Mr. Secretary, in what ways do you personally think that the report, the release, since the release 35 years ago, in what ways are Americans' education still at risk? Secretary Page.
I think the release of the NAEP report demonstrates the many different ways that we are still at risk. And I like to use the language of the report. Say that a rising tide of mediocrity threatens our future as a nation and as a people. And it is a good example and a good statement of our present condition. That's where we are now. We are still at risk, maybe even at greater risk.
Specifically, greater risk in what way?
In ways that we're not performing the kinds of processes and practices that we need to provide the kind of education for our children, especially low-income children, children with disabilities, all of our children, to become citizens of the United States, strong citizens of the United States, reach that potential and be able to contribute to us as a nation.
Secretary Spellings.
Well, one of the things I'm worried about right now is, and it was the case prior to the release of the Nation at Risk report, and that is a lack of a sense of urgency right now. I mean, we all served in a time when we had presidents that were really using that national bully pulpit to drive closing the achievement gap and on. And I think people are exhausted with education reform or feel like it's not possible to close the achievement gap. And so I think the boulder is drifting back down the hill because of a lack of urgency around the imperative of closing the achievement gap.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Duncan.
I guess a lot worries me. I think the biggest thing now I feel is that as a nation, we don't have any education goals. And I think for us, we can have lots of honest and vigorous debate around strategies to achieve goals. I think you see folks here on this stage who worked in an extraordinarily bipartisan way. And I'll just say personally, these 2 previous secretaries were amazing mentors of mine. I learned a lot from them. I was so happy to have John take over when I left. But I think there's some goals that I would propose. Much greater access to early childhood education, high quality. We got high school graduation rates to 84%. The goal should be to go to 90%. We want 100% of those graduating from high school ready for college and careers. We should try and lead the world in college completion rates. This is what Margaret's working on now. We're not close. For me, none of those goals are left or right or R or D. But if you ask anyone in the current administration what their education goal is, I don't think you'll get a coherent answer. That worries me.
Secretary King?
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything that's been said, and I would call our attention to another anniversary we just had, which was we marked 50 years since the death of Dr. King. And when you look at those NAEP results, one of the things that comes through most clearly are the huge gaps that we face for African American students, for Latino students, for our low-income students. If you look around the country, you see places that are more segregated today than they were 10 or 20 years ago. So we not only lack the urgency we need around education, we lack urgency around building a society that is just for all people. And until we get that sense of urgency back, the things for which Dr. King lived and died, we will continue to fall short.
Well, are the assessments that came out this week a red flag, and whose job? Is it now all the states? Can the states take on this authority and still get accountability? Secretary Spelling?
Oh, Lord. You know, we have recalibrated the federal role over and over throughout our history. And, you know, I'm a good card-carrying Republican, but I would just say, and I think it's a very Republican principle, that when we invest billions of dollars on behalf of poor, minority, special education students, et cetera, that we ought to get something for our money. And we do that by focusing on accountability for their performance. And when it's, you know, every man for himself and, you know, the fine print of accountability plans, the wonkery, as these gentlemen know, about the way states can and do manipulate the system to leave kids out, it's just worrisome. And so, you know, I want to believe, and I do think the strategies, the action have to be at the local level and have to be embraced in that way. But if I had a nickel for every superintendent and every chief state school officer that said, thank you, federal government, for keeping that push, that wind at our back, because the pressure to relent at the local level is fierce, as Rod will tell you.
Yes, you know, I think one part of the thing is I think we as a nation have really not, we say goals, but we really have not focused on them as goals. You asked about red flags. We ignore red flags such as this. We ignored the red flag of nation at risk. And that was a report in 2001 called the Hart-Rugman report that linked our education failings to national security. And I think that situation is even worse now. I think we're at greater risk now than we were even then. And I can't imagine a flag being redder or waved more vigorously than that. And that didn't attract the attention of our nation. It didn't move our interests in fixing this problem forward. I think we got a real problem here, and we got to find a way to fix it.
There was an independent peer review of every Student Succeeds Act. It found that plans that the states, this report says, the states largely squandered the opportunity provided by the Every Student Succeeds Act to create stronger, more innovative education plans. Is it working from where you can tell? I know you are all out of the government service now, but can the states pick up and get the accountability and have the plans have been approved so far? Should they have been? Are they right? Secretary Duncan?
Well, I don't think they squandered. I think they did exactly what they wanted to do. I mean, they knew what they were doing. That wasn't an accident. And I'll just echo what Secretary Spelling said, is we see this now, a push away from outcomes, from results from the left and the right. Mm-hmm. So the right, it's all about just local control. Like nothing about, is that better for kids or worse? Or are more kids learning? Or more kids graduating? It's just leave it to the locals. And these are broad stereotypes, so this isn't 100% fair on either side. On the left, it's often just give us more resources, but no conversation about better results for that. And so who is the voice for outcomes? Who's the voice for increasing graduation rates? Who's the voice for making sure more kids are ready for kindergarten? Where's the voice for more students being prepared to be successful in college and not take remedial classes?
Yeah.
You're not hearing that from either side right now, and that's a deafening silence, and that's a huge gap, and that hurts kids. That hurts kids. That's in the interest of adults.
This is an important moment for you four to be able to offer knowledgeable advice, experience to those in the education field now. John King, let me ask you, particularly with your experience at the state and local level, the power under this new law has shifted to the states from the federal government. What would be your advice to local policymakers to take advantage of that while maintaining the accountability? Advice to the field.
Yeah, well, one is states have to take seriously their responsibility to ensure good outcomes for all groups of students, right? One of the strengths of NCLB, there were weaknesses, but one of the strengths was the focus on the performance of groups of students, African-American students, Latino students, English learners, students with disabilities. States have to take that seriously. They can't give a school a pass just because the performance overall is better than average. Meanwhile, in that same school, African-American students are struggling or students with disabilities are struggling. So that's one. Two, states need to think beyond. There's an opportunity in ESSA for states to think beyond English, math, and high school graduation to things like chronic absenteeism, because we know if kids miss more than 10% of the school year, they're more likely to be retained in grade, more likely to drop out. So we can pay attention to that, then we have to act on it. Right? There's an opportunity to pay attention to not just whether or not students do well on their high school assessments, but whether or not they actually go on to post-secondary success in post-secondary education and training, right? That can be built into the accountability system. We can ask, are all kids getting equitable access to advanced placement classes, or even just chemistry and physics, which we know aren't offered in many high schools serving low-income kids. So there's an opportunity for states to be smart about what they pay attention to, but then they got to do something with the data. The action part is critical. Are you intervening with evidence-based strategies in schools that are struggling? And are you, if a strategy isn't working, are you willing to do the hard thing politically and ratchet up the intervention to make sure you get to better outcomes? And I will say that is all of that responsibility is with states. But the federal government has a job to do here to enforce the law and to ensure the civil rights guardrails that were part of that bipartisan law.
You know, I just want to add quickly is, you know, and George H.W. Bush was so instrumental in this. You know, if and when we're going to empower states as the laboratories of innovation and all of that, then we need convenings. They need to be learning from each other. You don't see that kind of summit and those sort of gatherings, the president, you know, that really keep the momentum behind governors that are doing the right thing. I remember when 43, Governor Bush was running for president, he and then North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, who would have thought I'd end up there X years later, you know, essentially we're doing the same kinds of policies. Rod, you'll remember the Rand report that called out North Carolina and Texas. So states were seen to be leading the reform movement. And I wouldn't say that that's true now.
I remember that very vigorously. Bush 41 convened all of the governors in Charlottesville to talk about education. President Clinton was one of the leaders in that group.
Exactly.
Bush convened it. He was one of the spectacular leaders there. And what came out of that was accountability systems and standards. And over a period of about 10, 15 years, we began to see real progress at what was going on, until the guardians of the status quo finally got themselves together and began to roll the situation backwards. And, you know, it may be necessary for us, once again, to convene all of the governors and talk about this issue, because I still believe that the national report for national security for the 21st century that linked our educational situation for our national well-being is ready to go again. We need it one more time.
Quick question. I'm all for convenings. Who should convene them?
The President of the United States. And the governors should be. That's what happened with Bush 41. Bush 41 convened them. All 50 governors attended.
I just think the leadership's not there, quite candidly.
Well, I'm not making a point like that. I'm just pointing out what did happen and what progress was made.
Well, that was a leading question. Maybe we convene them. Maybe we convene them.
Well, maybe, but we need to elevate. we need to elevate the national concern about our education failings.
I agree with that.
I agree with that.
Let me ask something as a reporter, because the prominence of education, no question, those of us who covered the White House I covered over a span of 7 presidents, education was usually not the top first 3 stories in an evening news lineup. And when you look at school coverage now, it's often much more about resource officers and lockdowns than it is about goals and how to reach those goals. Let me start with you, Secretary Duncan. Considering this current media climate, can a learning society, as the RISE Summit calls it, how can a learning society propel education to the top of that national agenda?
That's a perfect question. I don't have a good answer, but for me, that's the biggest issue. If you ask me what our biggest problem is, for me, our biggest problem is that no one votes along education. And again, we can debate any micro strategy, and that's fine to debate. If we just had a lot more people across the political spectrum, left and right, for governors, for mayors, the federal level, who cared about outcomes and hold those elected officials accountable, that would change everything for the better. Everything for better. But no one, if you watch the presidential debates, it breaks my heart. Education isn't discussed. It isn't talked about on either side. And so that is I'm not answering your question because I think we've all collectively failed on that. We have failed to make education an issue that anyone votes about.
Well, Secretary King, another motivating engine of this is parents. The parents of the kids who are in school, and they can't do it alone.
Just quickly, I'll let them answer. The problem is if you poll Americans' parents, they all say their school is good, but the rest of America's schools are not. That is not mathematically possible. That's called cognitive dissonance, but it's just like everyone likes their congressman and hates Congress.
Right. Yeah.
Those 2 things poll identically. That's the challenge. I'll let him solve it. I don't know the answer.
Well, part of the answer is in truth-telling to parents, right? We have to give parents a realistic perspective about where their kids are relative to their peers in the United States and across the world. And as folks understand where we are, then that helps to organize the pressure. But 2 hopeful points. One, there are states where I do think you see a strong leadership from the business community in particular, saying if we don't get this right, we have no economic future as a state. So I think about Tennessee. You know, you've got a conservative Republican governor, conservative Republican legislature that have prioritized investing in education and urgency about education equity because of a partnership between the business community that is saying we need an educated workforce for the future of our state, and a civil rights community that is organized around trying to work urgently to close the gaps for African American and Latino kids throughout the state. And so they have a commitment, Drive to 55, that they're going to get to 55% of the adults having a college degree or post-secondary credential. And across sectors, people talk about the Drive to 55, higher ed, K-12, business community, civil rights community. That's powerful. The other thing I'd say is every problem we have in education is being solved somewhere, right? There's nothing wrong with education that can't be fixed by what's right with education. Somewhere people are solving. They're getting career and technical education right in a way that prepares young people for success in college and jobs. They're getting English learner education right in a way that gives kids access to English but helps them become bilingual. The question is, do we have the will to take those things to scale?
Here's an example. For example, I agree with that completely. For example, even with the stagnation that we see on the report that we just looked at. But when we look at it very carefully, there are islands of excellence there. Mm-hmm. Look at what's going on in Florida. We see the principles of what created the environment in Florida. We see the leadership that Governor Bush provided in Florida that brought that situation to the gold standard that it exists now. And so our problem is we don't learn from the issues. We just repeat the bad things over and over again. But here's an issue that we've got to decide upon. We've got to confront the gardens of the status quo and find a way to move forward.
And I was going to say, build on John's point about, the drive to 55. We need an awareness campaign or a moral imperative that people can rally around. And, we did that with No Child Left Behind when people said we needed to challenge the soft bigotry of low expectations, language like a new civil right. I mean, maybe civil rights are not fashionable now. I don't know what. But what is it that will unite us around this shared value, this imperative of making improvements? Maybe it's economic growth, maybe it's civil rights, maybe it's both, but it's kind of, we've drifted. And what is it that is our, Condi Rice said this morning, our country is organized around an idea, not around a racial group, a religious preference, or whatever. An idea that education is the great equalizer, and somehow we forgot that.
Just quickly, the Tennessee example I think is so important now because it's real and it's current. So you have a governor who happens to be a Republican. I had dinner with him recently, asked him what does he consider some of his greatest successes. He puts at the top of his list free community college for all. That's historically not a Republican idea. And so we need to encourage leadership on both sides who are willing to do non-traditional things and challenge their base a little bit. But the fact that that drive to 55 is being driven by his push to create not a K-12 system, but a pre-K to 14 system, that's very different thinking, and we just don't see enough of that, and then we don't reward it in democracy. We don't have not enough folks replicating that.
Well, until you get a college president running for president of the United States, that always seems to help an occupation or a point of view, getting somebody running for president. But those of you, I
thought you were asking me to run for president. Just kidding.
Hey, that'd be a good primary, boy.
Considering I asked you all for advice that you could give to state and localities, are there, I would like to switch and ask you to look back at each of your tenures, some of you longer than others, and I'm going to start with Arne Duncan because I think you may have been in Secretary's office longer than the others. Would you look back at your experiences and think about where you made the most progress, and then also where something you thought would go through ran into a speed bump? Think back to those early.
Sure, I always talk about a couple of successes and a couple of failures, and to be clear, the successes are never enough. You always want to do more and go further, so this is not ever mission accomplished, but success was a huge investment in high-quality early childhood education that historically never happened at the federal level, more than $1 billion. That was fantastic. Talked about high school graduation rates at 84%. We were record highs. Again, I wish the national goal was to get to 90%, but no one's talking about that. We got $40 billion for Pell Grants without going back to taxpayers for nickel. Went from 6 million Pell recipients to 9 million. In part because of that, we had another 1 million students of color go on to college. So those are things that you feel really good about, but again, all of it you would like to do more. On the failure side, the flip side of the early childhood is the demand was so much greater, there's so much more need out there, and we would have liked to have made a multi-billion-dollar investment so that we would not have millions of kids across the country starting kindergarten a year to 16 months behind. And candidly, we weren't able to get some of our Republican friends to make that kind of match that would have matched what states wanted. Not to go on too long, my hardest conversations was a Republican governor in Mississippi who was devastated that we couldn't give him more money for pre-K in Mississippi. And kids needed everywhere across the country, but nowhere more than Mississippi, so that one really hurt. Second failure was our inability to get financial aid for Dreamers and any kind of immigration reform. And the fact that we are marginalizing kids who work so hard and play by all the rules and tell them they can't go to college, that just breaks my heart. And I'd argue our biggest failure was our inability to get anything done in terms of gun control. And President Obama's talked about this. I've talked about the hardest day of his presidency, and he had some hard days, was the day of the Sandy Hook massacre. He went down the next day. Vice President Jill's husband and I went down a couple of days later, and the fact that after that we got nothing done. And this is a tough thing to say, but I've been dealing a lot with the kids from Parkland, Florida, and going back and forth, and they've been in Chicago. And had we got something done, maybe the Parkland massacre doesn't happen.
And now we have Parkland students taking the issue to a new level in a faster.
They have a chance to succeed, but we failed. We failed, and hopefully they'll succeed where we didn't.
Yeah, Secretary King, you picked up from Arne Duncan. Talk about your year.
Yeah. I mean, I think in many ways, the fate of ESSA implementation will determine how good a job we did in that last year in trying to set the table, at least for some states who want to do the right thing, to do the right thing. You know, we positioned the federal government to enforce the civil rights guardrails of the law. The current administration, in my view, is not doing that. But there is the opportunity for states to use ESSA on behalf of equity. You know, the thing that I worry about, and I agree with everything Arnie said, both about the progress and the struggles and work undone of the Obama administration, the two things I would add, school diversity. We have to acknowledge that in this country, we are not fulfilling the promise of Brown versus Board of Education. You can go to schools here in this district. You can go to schools where there's one school that has 90% low-income students, all students of color, and within a mile a school that has 10, 20% low-income students and dramatically fewer students of color. We are still running segregated school systems throughout this country, and we have not done enough to tackle that issue. We tried in the administration to persuade Congress to put resources towards accelerating school diversity work. Kids do better, low-income kids do better, kids of color do better when they have access to the resources that in American society typically follow white, middle-class, and affluent kids. And white kids do better when they have the opportunity to go to school with a diverse student population. The other place it's related, where we started to do some work, but there's so much more to do, is around diversity of teachers. You know, a majority of the kids in our public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African American men. And we know that kids of color need to see role models in classrooms, but white kids also need to see teachers and school leaders of color. And so the hard conversations around race are urgently needed in this country, and we just haven't gotten as far as we need to.
But parents want their kids to go to school as close, very often as close to home as possible, and there you get into the geographic and the neighborhoods and a much broader segment of what makes those decisions come true.
No question that housing and housing segregation and school segregation are interconnected, but there are many places around the country, including this city, where the schools are more segregated than the housing, right? And we also know that folks are very willing to go a little further for things they want for their kids. A Montessori school, we have some very strong public Montessori schools around the country, people go a little further. An art school for their kids, people will go to a neighboring district to get that art school. A great career and technical education program where you graduate with an associate's degree and a high school diploma and first in line for a job, people go a little further for that. But we make the choice to maintain a segregated society, and we do that at our peril.
Secretary Page, I covered the No Child Left Behind effort, and it was like one of the second or third week of the administration when the whole week by the president was devoted to education. Margaret, you were domestic policy chief. And I remember President Bush reaching out to Ted Kennedy and then telling us that he had to go back down to Crawford, Texas, and explain to the boys at the coffee stop in Crawford why he was even speaking to Ted Kennedy, who the guys in Texas thought was just about the impersonation of evil because he was a liberal Democrat. That issue, Secretary Page, was one of the most unusual I covered in that era because it did bring together, and it took a lot of effort to get, so that obviously an achievement that you can hold up as the bright torch.
Absolutely. It was a bipartisan initiative. We've not seen much like that since. We refer to the big four in the congressional part. Kennedy and Gregg in the Senate, Boehner and Miller in the House, working together. They are really the authors of the No Child Left Behind Act. President Bush proposed it, initiated it, got them going, but I had the blessing of being able to sit in the company of those four men and watch them work together on a real critical issue for the United States of America. And I saw no partisanship. I saw them working together and making the situation much better. And that's what's going to have to be is going to happen for us to make this better? But there's some really tough issues that we got to face. And we can talk around these issues, but if we don't confront them, we're not going to get anywhere.
And
there's a strong movement now, for example, that seems to ignore the fact that just before 1990, we had a real problem with our performance of our kids. Then the summit at Charlottesville, standards and accountability for those standards were put on the table, and you could gradually see the change that took place up through the next decade and a half. And accountability was a central part of it. But now when you see the tax on accountability that moved backwards, you see our progress moving backwards.
Absolutely.
Accountability is an important part of education reform and education work, and the extent to which we allow that to go by without facing it, we'll pay the price for our continued failures for kids to perform right.
Let me get to Secretary Spellings before I go back to you, Secretary Duncan. Margaret, you picked up from Rod Page as Secretary.
Right, and I, like Rod, saw them work together. I have on my office wall the bill signing pen and the Senate vote, which was 87 to 10.
That's right.
In the Senate. Hard to believe you could pass a motion to adjourn 87 to 10 these days on something that affected every community in this nation. That's right. A major piece of legislation, obviously. And so, it said that every kid matters, and it had muscle in it. And, and it worked. Right. That's the main thing. It really worked. And then, of course, the Obama administration built on that with the race to the top and so forth. And so clearly that's a high water mark. With respect to failings, in the giant scheme of things, the fact that we didn't get comprehensive immigration reform done, and we were pretty darn close, as you'll recall. It's kind of like Arnie's issue with guns. Would we have all this DACA issue if we had gotten a solution then? Anyway, coulda, woulda, shoulda.
Yeah, Secretary Duncan, had you wanted to jump in?
No, just quickly. It's almost like it feels like a bygone era where you had a big four and people could talk and solve stuff. And I'll go back again that we don't vote for people who are allowed to compromise. Like that's seen as a sign of weakness. And we can argue the pros and cons, and No Child Left Behind, what worked, what didn't. Right. But the point is, you had great leadership on both sides, finding common ground. You said not working in any partisan way. And that's what our country needs. And that's, again, we don't vote for people. That's seen as weakness, not as strength. And so that worries me a lot.
And, they don't come any more liberal than George Miller and Ted Kennedy, or any more conservative than John Boehner and Judd Gregg.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Certainly, each of you must have had experiences in visiting classrooms, visiting schools that made a deep impression, or even somewhat changed the kind of ivory tower view you had back in Washington. Secretary King, can you think of a classroom visit or a particular student or a particular community that impressed you during your tenure?
Yeah, I'll share with you one experience around technology, because everybody's talking about how technology is the answer, right? And personalized learning is the answer. But I have to say, I visit a lot of schools. I still do. I've been in a lot of schools where the way they're using the technology is they just took the worksheet, and instead of having it on the desk, it's on a screen, right? They're actually not using technology to change learning. One exception to that was a classroom I visited, a Project Lead the Way classroom. Kids were doing pre-engineering work. Kids were working in pairs. So if Arnie and I were a pair, both of us would do computer-assisted design. These are high school students. Arnie would do his design on his computer. I'd do my design on the computer. Then we'd swap designs, go into the shop. I'd build Arnie's design. He would build mine. Right? That's real performance-based assessment. That's really using the technology to make a different kind of learning possible. Unfortunately, I don't see enough of that. But that's the kind of thing that would inspire me about what's possible in schools.
Yeah. Any recollections you have? I traveled with the president and you through schools all the time.
Three very fast. One was Columbus, New Mexico, which was the border of Mexico, where kids who lived in Mexico but were American citizens crossed that border each morning to get an education, just the thought of the American dream. And teachers and buses meeting them at 6 in the morning to bring them. That was really powerful. Second was Worcester Tech, which was a career and technical school in Boston. Outside of Boston, it was horrific. And it had the traditional auto body and mechanics and that kind of stuff. But they had a credit union in the school. They had a fully functioning veterinary clinic in the school. They had a place that if you were going through chemotherapy, you could get a wig at the school. So the school became the center of the community. The final example was in Carrollton, Georgia, which is rural, white, poor, where kids who by every measure were the most at risk to drop out, none of the kids I talked to had parents who graduated from high school, they spent half the day on the second floor of the building going to school, and the first floor they ran a South Wire plant. They ran the plant, they did the tech support, they ran the shifts, and that plant ran that as a profit. So the kids who are most at risk of dropping out were driving a productive business.
I remember reading with a little girl, and I think it was maybe in Baltimore or somewhere up in this area, and she asked me if she could go home with me. She's a little whippersnapper of a reader, and it hit me that, you know, the best part of this child's life was her school and that environment. And I think, you know, we do that over and over every day. One of the things that used to drive me crazy and still does is when I hear people say, you know, some parents just don't care about their kids and what kind of education. I just reject that in every single way. I never met a parent anywhere that didn't want the best for their child.
Yeah. Secretary Page, thinking back to your the first term of the Bush administration, I covered you as well, going with the president to so many places. Right. Indelible impressions.
I think probably the most indelible impression was my trip with the president to Florida. Mm-hmm. We got the news about 9/11 and seeing what occurred at that moment, and finally staying in Florida for several days because we couldn't get flight back to Washington. I've said some comical things to the president one time. He left, you know, and so I said to him one time when I got back, I said, Mr. President, you know, I go all over the nation promoting No Child Left Behind for you, but you left me in Florida.
I was there with them, standing in the classroom, second grade classroom. Yeah. And I remember writing in my reporter's notebook, 9:07 a.m., Andy Card whispers, because nobody interrupts a president, even in front of a classroom of second graders. Right. And he stood and went into the next room and got the news about the attacks. And we came outside the small pool of reporters who were with the president. We went out into the parking lot, and R.E. Fleischer, the press secretary, comes over and says, keep the president your camera right here. The president's going to come make a statement. I said, no, he's not. We're in a parking lot. This camera's not plugged into anything. But the cameras, the live cameras in the cafeteria where the president was to speak, are already up and running. The world is watching those. So they decided they would go into the cafeteria. They didn't want to scare the kids. Mm-hmm. And I do remember the president speaking for less than 1 minute and then saying, and Rod Page will stand here and explain to you the rest of the education.
We prepared for that meeting, and we had a meeting to discuss how we're going to handle the meeting, and my job was to introduce the president. That was my job. That's all I prepared for. And the president left the meeting to me, and I'm standing in front of all these people from Florida and news people all over the place. And
wow.
That's an indelible moment.
Yeah. We've got time to cover two more areas, and the first one, I'm going to start with Secretary Spellings on this. As the RISE planners told me as they put this together, that this room is filled with leading minds on education in the 21st century. And they asked me, how can everyone present in this room and the stakeholders who could not be present but hopefully are watching on live streams or will watch the archived video, how can they affirm their commitment to educating all of our children to be engaged citizens and prepared for the 22nd century? How can we make progress together? Now, you've touched on this about trying to bridge across partisan divides, but could each of you think, starting Secretary Spellings with, and you're now running a university system where you bridge divides as well, there have to be ways to make sure that American education moving ahead, not looking back 35 years, but moving forward, that forces can be brought in to build together.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and this is true at the state level, it certainly was true in Washington, we have to refresh and reinvigorate this combination of the business community and the civil rights community, who were a mighty force in causing the standards and accountability movement and whatnot. And you know, as some have determined, the forces of the status quo on both sides of the aisle, you know, are on an ascent at the moment. And, you know, they do a good job. They have their reasons. They represent vested stakeholders. They represent people on the payroll. That's what they're supposed to do. But we together have to restore that coalition of the business community and civil rights community, and we need to do it locally. So for a university president, in my case, running 14 teacher preparation programs, that means how do we make sure that our teacher prep programs, as the #1 producer of teachers in North Carolina, are using research-based strategies and focusing on standards and the kinds of learners that those teachers are going to meet when they get in their classrooms. So what's your piece of the action? Identify it and go to work on it.
Yeah. Let me go down, Secretary Duncan, the kinds of things projecting forward.
So I think that business civil rights coalition is a powerful one, morally, economically, and I second that. I worry about the breakdown of our democracy and, again, being able to find compromise and work together, so way beyond just education or reading or math, how we participate in a civic democracy. I don't have easy answers. I just keep coming back to we need to create opportunities for kids to serve and serve together, whether it's middle school students or high school students or college students, to work together to better their communities, and that cuts through race and class and backgrounds or whatever. And the more we can have kids actively contributing and working in teams of kids that aren't like them from different backgrounds, I think that's one way to start to build some trust and start to build relationships that hopefully will stay with them as they become adults.
Yeah. Secretary King.
Yeah, I'd build on Arnie's point about the strength of our democracy. There are a bunch of folks in this room who are working on issues of civic education. I worry that, as a former high school social studies teacher, I particularly worry that social studies and civic education don't get the attention they should in schools. We were talking earlier, some of us, about the fact that studies show that maybe as little as 16 minutes a day are spent on social studies in the early grades in elementary school. We need to prepare young people not only to succeed in English and math and get good jobs, but we need to prepare them to vote, to actively participate in government, to go to town hall or community meeting in their town and convey their ideas and concerns. We see that in the young people from Parkland. But that's not by accident. That's because of an intentionality in Broward County about preparing young people to do public speaking and to engage in community service and to read critically and make good arguments about the ideas that they have. So we need to invest in a sort of bipartisan, nonpartisan way in social studies education, civic education, programs like MICVA Challenge that's in the room that helps young people design projects around civic engagement, or iCivics that's in the room that's creating games that get kids to learn the knowledge they need to be good citizens. That work to me is critical. If we don't do it, we will see voter participation continue to go down and we will lose our democracy.
And Secretary Page.
Yeah, I would like to build on that comment that you were making. I'm very concerned about this because I think that we have a national priority that's not focused on education. And I think that education does deserve a higher ranking in our minds. There's plenty of evidence of this. School board elections would be a good one, mostly in the teens. And so we say that it's for the public. The public is not embracing public education. We need to have the leadership to go out and help explain to this nation why it is important that we win the education battle. The report on national security for the 21st century by Rugman and Hart barely got a bleep in the public's attention. And it made really stark statements about why it was important that we elevate our education aspirations. I look forward to this panel and this audience spreading the word that we need to elevate the priority for education in the United States of America.
And the media needs to, media is a big word now rather than just news coverage, but a whole sense of communication and media in this country are not spending the kind of attention on the substantive issues.
Yeah, they're spending attention on crime and things like that, and there are a lot of bad actors like that sometimes in education, but the education policy and education process is what we need more attention on.
But you know what, Ann, I think, you know, we all, and we're here because we want to solve problems, and we talk a lot about what we're doing wrong. And I think the public gets exhausted and thinks, oh my God, this is just an intractable problem, we can never. Is it possible to close the achievement gap? To challenge the soft bigotry of low expectations, to set high expectations that people can and do and will meet. And so I would challenge the press to start, you know, telling some of the stories that we all know exist about where it's working. We know what to do. And please help us tell the folks that it can be done.
Secretary King?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have this podcast we did at the Education Trust called Extraordinary Districts, and we tell the story of the progress that Chicago has made, right? We tell the story of the progress that Steubenville, Ohio has made. We tell the story of the progress that Lexington, Massachusetts made. Now, Lexington is an affluent community where the superintendent identified that it was an affluent community that was doing well for a lot of kids, but was doing not well for African-American kids. African-American kids were struggling and were not getting what they needed, and so the superintendent organized the district in partnership with his union, organized the district to look at why, to change teaching practice, to do professional development for teachers, to change teachers' expectations, to challenge teachers around whether or not they were giving the same opportunities to kids of color as they were giving to white students. And Lexington, Massachusetts changed the outcomes for their African-American students. We tell those stories because there are all these great stories of success, and we've got to get more places to adopt those practices. And that's the job, I would argue, of the federal government and the state, to both identify those, lift them up, but then push people to do them. It's not okay to just be satisfied with chronically low performance.
Let me ask you as well, Mr. Secretary, civil rights groups have sent letters stating that the plans of the U.S. Department of Education that the department has already approved, they say actually violate federal laws. Was the Secretary wrong to have approved the plans that have been approved so far?
I mean, it's clear that there are plans that allow states to overlook the performance of groups of students. That is, to look at school performance without respect to whether or not African-American students are improving, Latino students are improving, English learners are improving, students with disabilities are improving. That does violate the very civil rights guardrails that were intended in the bipartisan law. But my hope is that the department will listen and change course. You know, one of the great privileges of the job that we all got to hold is that you spend a lot of time talking to students and parents and teachers, but then you have to actually listen. And it's important to listen to the folks who are saying, hey, we can't ignore the chronic achievement gaps that we have all across the country.
Well, and I think it's also incumbent on us to point out to governors who are not edu-wonks like we are about the fine print of their state plans. That these super subgroups and the definition of the academic year and the confidence interval and all the wonkery that undergirds their plans are letting a lot of kids fall through the cracks.
Just to be a little provocative, I always just try and be honest and blunt, is that, I just get speaking personally, if we're going to wait on this administration to take civil rights protection seriously, I think we're going to wait for a long time. And I think we got to come at this a very different way. I'll go right back to the gun issue where we as adults have failed and students are stepping up and challenging all of us in some very different ways. What if we had students walking out of schools where they don't have access to AP classes or don't have access to technology What if students took ownership of this and didn't wait for adults, and didn't wait for the federal government? That's the kind of leadership that I think we desperately need. And a lot of work to do on the gun issue, but if the education issue can move in parallel and be led by teams demanding for themselves and for their younger siblings a much better education, that would cut through any of the silliness here in DC.
I wanted to close by asking a kind of a 35-year question, not looking back at 35 years ago, because I had 4 babies during the Reagan administration. And I have all 4 of them are now grown, all 4 are married. The baby is finishing his chief resident year. He's a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. So my kids have, and I've got several grandchildren, all girls. And so I now look at education from the point of view of a parent who, from the time that the report came out 35 years ago, through No Child Left Behind, through the new ESSA, my grandchildren are going to be adults 35 years from now. I'd like each of you to think, and this is unfair to surprise you with this, but what can you imagine American classrooms and American schools looking like 30 years from now? Technology that we hadn't even thought of before, the resources of who will want to be teachers, who will step up, and whether the balance between the federal government, state and local control, whether that will begin to shift. Does anybody want a first crack at what we'll see? I'm going to hit John King first. What the state of education might look at 35 years from now?
I'll tell you what I hope it looks like. I mean,
that's fine.
I hope that we have classrooms that reflect the diversity we value, that kids have an opportunity to learn with kids who are different from them and to learn from each other. I hope that we have classrooms where technology is used as a tool by teachers to strengthen kids' learning experience, not to replace teachers, but as a tool to support them. And I hope that we have learning that is active and engaged. I have an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old. They come home every day, and they let me know which classes were engaging and which were not, right? The science class where there's an experiment and you are seeing something amazing and writing about it and coming to understand how the world works. The social studies class where you're debating a current events issue in the context of what the founders said about it. Right? Those are the things that inspire kids, so I would want all kids to have that all day. And we do have schools like that. They're just not available to all kids on an equitable basis. But the last thing I'd say is, at the center of schools is the relationship between teachers and kids and the work in which they're engaged. And 30 years from now, that's still going to be true. It was a relationship with a 4th, 5th, 6th grade teacher, Mr. Osterwald, that saved my life when my parents passed. He changed my life. If not for him, in my New York City public school, I wouldn't be alive today. And 30 years from now, there's going to be a kid who the only person in their life, and it goes to Margaret's point, the only person in their life who's giving them a place that is safe and supportive and engaging is a teacher. And I hope that that teacher is there saving that kid's life, because that's what teachers do every day.
I think this is going to be true more in secondary and post-secondary education, but I can imagine, maybe this is a little more cynical, kiosks or, kind of transactional centers where students who have learned online and at a library and in a workplace and in an apprenticeship and whatnot, they are going to evidence and proctor a test, take a proctored test, basically just, get the servicing of their gathering of their credential and their learning that is happening all around them in a million different ways. And I worry that this institution that's known as our public schools and our public institution system will be trimmed. It will exist in elementary and middle schools maybe, but that there'll be a trend towards just every man for himself, go get it where you find it, come, take a test, evidence it, and there'll be some value in some of this because it'll be ubiquitous, it'll be free, it'll be whatever. but there's a lot of worrisome elements.
Technology is a great tool and but it does take away so much of the personal contact, exactly what you were saying, Secretary King. Arnie, Duncan, do you want to take a crack at what it'll look like when you turn 60?
Well, we have 100,000 schools. I don't know how many classrooms. So the short answer is going to look radically different, and it should look radically different. I'll just say, Ann, that for me, one of my biggest hopes would be the pride when you just spoke about your son who's becoming a doctor. I would hope that we could have the same pride if our children were becoming teachers, and I don't think we're close to that right now. Today, not enough parents or grandparents would speak with that level of genuine, authentic joy if their children were going into education. So if we can fundamentally change the status and the value of educators, to go back to John's points, how important, so that'd be, for me, a fundamental transformation that we're not close to. The second one, I'll just go back to my other point, is I would hope every school or kiosk, whatever it is, would understand the importance of their role in having us become the best educated nation on the planet, and what they're going to do to contribute to that. And again, lots of different strategies, lots of different debates about how to do that, but having a real clarity around goals and how all of us in our own ways are contributing to this larger goal. Those two things happen, that would make me much more optimistic.
And that will be a factor of political leadership, governmental leadership?
Again, I'll put it on us in this room. I never blame politicians, I blame us as voters. And it's us as voters holding everyone accountable across the board for having clear goals and either making progress or not towards those goals.
Coming back to Secretary Page to let you close out as you open it up, the senior member here.
First of all, I thank my colleagues here for their comments and their thoughts and their leadership in this very delicate field where leadership is so needed. And I feel a little optimism because of the existence of technology that is picking up speed so fast that it's just forcing change in our education system. And it's pretty difficult to imagine what it's going to be like. At one time, I was a little pessimistic about a change because we are still operating with a system that matured in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There are also guardians of the status quo who are not interested in change. But that's been overcome now by leadership and also by the interests of parents and business people about getting their children a great education. So I'm beginning to pick up a little optimism about that now. I think what we're going to see in the next 15, 20 years or so reestablishing our U.S. leadership in education relative to our Asian and European neighbors.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this brought to a good conclusion the kind of very broad-reaching, looking both back and forward for this conference. Please thank Rod Page, Margaret Spellings, Arnie Duncan, and John King. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now invite you to join us for the RISE Award reception